Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Today, I conduct a conversation with a conductor who was born in Australia, studied in the UK and the US, and has held title positions in France, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Since 2014, he's been the principal conductor and artistic director of the Xi'an Symphony Orchestra in China. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dane Lam. Dane, it is lovely to meet you and to speak with you and to chat with you today. How are you?
I'm very happy to be joining you, Mike.
Well, that's good. There's a bit of a time difference. It's 10:30 in the morning on a Monday here, and it's 8:30 in the evening where you are. Where in Australia are you?
I am in Brisbane at the moment, in sunny Queensland, but I just returned from Perth last night, which is 2 hours behind us.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure what time it is, to be honest.
Well, you spend a lot of time sort of going between there and China, and I know you're in the UK pretty soon, aren't you, as well? So we'll maybe get on to dealing with time differences as a guest and travelling conductor later on. But you're at home in Queensland, which is where you were born and where you started. I know that you, the piano, the clarinet, and the saxophone are instruments that you played as a child. Were your parents musical at all? And how did music first come into your world?
There's never been any professional musicians in my family. My mother and my grandma both played the piano, and my dad played a bit of guitar, I suppose. But music wasn't really on my radar as a career until I went to high school. I went to a fantastic public high school, as in state high school in Queensland, that had a really extensive music program, various orchestras, jazz ensembles, wind bands, choirs, small jazz ensembles of all kinds of different levels. And that's where I saw somebody conducting for the first time, one of my teachers, and I thought, oh, that might be interesting. And Queensland actually punches far above its weight in Australia in terms of principal players in the various state orchestras because of the fantastic youth music provision here.
Well, that's great. I mean, it's a hot topic for me, youth music, and the fact that it's slowly been dying over the last 20 odd years or so, and seemingly seems to be given a kick in the head yet again quite recently by the UK government. But it's good that you were in that. I mean, is it still much the same now in Queensland as it was then when you were studying?
As far as I know, it's the same. I don't have a lot to do with it, but actually in June this year, I'm really happy to be returning to conduct it's called MOSE, Musically Outstanding Students. And they're the very best instrumentalists from all over the state. And it's a vast state. You could fit a few UKs into Queensland.
Yeah.
And they get all together for a week and we play some music. And so it's just nice to come back and give back a little bit.
Yes, I agree with that. We're going to go on. Well, I'm going to mention the University of Queensland now and probably a lot later because of your post there as associate lecturer. But you studied at the University of Queensland. Did you go primarily as an instrumentalist, or did you go because it's listed that your conducting teacher there was Gwyn Roberts? How soon into university did conducting start for you, or had it already started before you went?
Yeah, it had already started. In fact, I was accepted into university as a pianist, actually, but I'd already started conducting, and it's what I wanted to do because I came along at a time when the Australian government was investing a ton of money into the training of conductors through Symphony Australia. The program doesn't exist anymore, but you were able to work with the various state orchestras and chief conductors and their guest conductors in various master courses throughout the year. And so I started that when I was still in high school, actually, with Chris Seaman, who I know has been on this show.
Yeah, and mentioned teaching in Australia as well.
He was a huge influence to us, a 17-year-old. And so to go back to your question, UQ, the University of Queensland, were really flexible and accommodating my being in this Symphony Australia course, which required quite a lot of interstate travel even then. So I started off as a pianist, but they very graciously allowed me to change my major in second semester of first year because there just was, it was taking up all my time anyway.
Mm. Well, that's good. And as you know, because I know you've listened to, I think you said most of the episodes, which is very kind of you indeed. I always ask about teachers, and I've got three names on him, possibly two, but two definitely that I've never asked about before. What was Gwyn Roberts like as a teacher? Was he a overall holistic, or was he very much stick or very much score?
Oh, well, I was very much a beginner at that
Yeah.
stage, and Gwyn uh, is to this day such a nurturing person. He was at a very young age. He was the principal cellist of the Tasmanian Symphony Orchestra, and then he got into conducting. Moved up to Brisbane and conducted the orchestra of the university, and taught conducting. And so he sort of guided me through those very early years after I had the initial influence through these, 1 week long courses with Symphony Australia. He was the steady hand that would sort of translate what all these great maestros were telling me, because often they were quite contradictory. And he would help me absorb a score, tell me if I wasn't clear, call me out on mannerisms that I was already developing, and
Yeah, yeah.
and just help me. It was a very, being exposed to all these international conductors quite early on. It could have been very confusing if there wasn't somebody who was steady there.
Yeah, I mean that is something we all have to negotiate. Even as instrumentalists, when you go on to studying at a conservatoire or a university, you have a primary teacher, but you are put in front of others in masterclass situations, and yeah, those conflicting views are something that you need to sort of process and work out. And if you've got somebody there like Gwyn who's going to help you do that for you, that's really helpful, isn't it?
Oh, it's so helpful. It's so helpful. And he's still around Brisbane. He still comes to concerts when I conduct here. It's lovely.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. So how long were you at the University of Queensland with Gwyn before I'm assuming the chronology is right here, and I'll please tell me if it isn't, before you become assistant to Gianluigi Gelmetti with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. How long were you, did that run back to back?
Yeah, there was overlap there,
Mm.
which is another reason why UQ was so accommodating in letting me major in conducting, because it was actually only a few weeks into me starting university out of high school. And one of the Symphony Australia modules, they called them, this week-long masterclass was with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra and Gianluigi Gelmetti, who at that time was the incoming chief conductor of the Sydney Symphony, and he was also the music director of the Rome Opera.
Mm.
And so I went along to this masterclass. I really knew very little, and it went okay. And then I got this phone call at the end of the week saying, "Oh, the maestro would like to meet with you." And
Yeah.
so I went into the lobby of his hotel, and he had this thick Italian drawl. He was Roman. He was larger than life, and he said to me, "You're a very lucky boy. Next week you come with me to the Sydney Opera House, conduct the Sydney Symphony, and then you come with me to Siena to do my masterclass." And then I spent 3 summers with him in Siena, several years in Sydney, sharing the podium with him. And he was absolutely my first big influence.
Yeah, yeah. And you look back now, and I'm assuming you think, yes, you were a very lucky boy. What a lovely way of breaking it to you. Um, what was he like? I mean, again, going back to score or stick or both. I mean, by now, if you say that he was your first real mentor, how much of what he taught you still sticks today?
Well, I find a lot of the things that he used to say in my late teens and early 20s, they didn't really hit home until many, many, many years later. And he said he wasn't interested in technique, but actually he was.
Yeah.
He was always correct. conducting technique, but he was very old school. He used to say that he didn't have students, he had disciples.
Right.
And he had, I used to joke that he had a wardrobe of dozens of black smocks, because he always wore exactly the same thing every day, for rehearsal, for dinner, for concerts. It didn't matter. It was always the same thing. And so his masterclass that he held every summer in Siena was a bit like that TV show Survivor,
Right.
where he took in all these there were active students and there were passive students that were selected after auditions, but it could change at any moment. If you did something that he didn't think was right, and he would put it out to the passive students who thinks they could do better, who thinks this tempo is too fast, who thinks this tempo is too slow. And before you know it, you could be out. You could be passive.
Oh, he sounds like a real character. I like people like that. I really do.
He used to say, after 3 years with me, working with a professional orchestra will be like a holiday.
Oh, that's brilliant. On from there to Juilliard and a master's with James de Priest, who I know I cannot remember who it was, but I know I've discussed him before. So we leave Australia. I mean, I know you've been taking trips to Siena and possibly to Rome, but now we do the inevitable thing of leaving Australia and going and living abroad and living in New York. How was that?
At first, I was discussing this with somebody the other night, actually. As a boy from Brisbane going to Juilliard, and you walk past Itzhak Perlman in the hallway or whatever.
Yeah.
I had big imposter syndrome at first, and I thought they had made a mistake on the tests or whatever. And you have to take placement tests when you first arrive as well, once you've been admitted for ear training and for history and for theory. Anyway, they didn't kick me out. And the most fantastic thing about being a conductor at Juilliard was that there were only 3 of us,
right,
for the whole 2-year master's course. So we got 45 minutes to an hour each week with full orchestra. And so James de Priest, Maestro de Priest, was one of the most wonderful things about Maestro de Priest as a teacher was that he didn't seek to impose his own view of how to conduct. You would know that there's other music schools and there's other conducting pedagogues.
Yes.
Who seek to make you look exactly how they look, little clones of them. But he knew we were all different, and he was interested more in how we thought about the music than the way we actually conducted, the way we waved our arms about. And he would, of course, intervene if something wasn't working, but he was so interesting in our placement test, in the actual entrance exam, before we conducted the orchestra. We had these very strange questions that we had to sort of expound upon. So one of them was, composer is to architect as conductor is to what? Or we had 10 minutes to write an essay comparing Anton Webern to Gustav Mahler.
Right. Yeah.
And these were the kind of things that he was interested in. And then, of course, we had to conduct the Rite of Spring with the orchestra. But before that, he just wanted to see how we thought about music and how we approached life and people. I'm
interested. What was your answer to the first question? Can you remember?
Yeah, I can. I said engineer. I still think that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably the best answer. I was trying to think. I was going to go for builder as a quick answer, or craftsman. I don't know, but yeah, I think engineer is probably the right answer. I mean, that whole teaching style, I very much agree with. And on a recent interview, another name who's going to crop up in your career also said much the same. Mark Heron, about the fact that we're all different. We all have different body sizes. We all have different physiques, and whilst there are some fundamentals of conducting that one can almost not insist on, but one can sort of lay out on the table, so much of what we do is so personal because of the nature of what it is, and it would be crazy to try and impose something. It's much different. My violin teacher I've said it before on the podcast. She was 5'1" and I'm 6 foot. And my hands were almost twice the size of hers. There was no way I could ever be a clone of her. And so, it wasn't possible. And much the same now. I teach people who are shorter than me, who are, and yeah, you just have to talk about some fundamentals, but then the rest of it, they need to work it out themselves.
That's right. You see what doesn't work, but then it's so funny, isn't it? How people think that people who are not intimately involved with the orchestral world think that conducting is some kind of code where one gesture means a G sharp, another one means an A flat, and you have to explain to them that these are signals, physical signals that have to be understood instinctively and immediately.
Yeah,
and then you wonder how can any two conductors do it the same way?
Exactly, and I think that's also part of the thing when we come to guest conduct, is that none of us, I would say, have 100% hit rate on everybody we guest conduct. There are certain things you do instinctively as a gesture because you know that it works with 85% of the orchestras you've ever worked with. But that could be one of the 15% where they look at you and think, well, what does that mean? I mean, when I teach, I talk about
Exactly.
universal body language, the fact that, if I put my hand and palm out in front of you, it means stop, or stop what you're doing, and there are certain things that transmit. Mm-hmm. I was watching a concert on the TV last night and my wife came in and said, what does that gesture mean? I said, well, I think it means this. I'm an ex-orchestra player of 22 years. I wasn't sure. I said, but he's getting the result that he wants. And that's the point, It is endlessly fascinating. And I think for anybody who's not in our world, who's never played for a conductor or actually conducted, I think they are fascinated by what it means. And I think there are times the answer is, I don't know, but it's working.
Yeah, that's right.
Cool. Going on, as I've just mentioned him, we then leave Juilliard and go to I would say in the UK, the place where the best program has been historically for the last, I don't know how many years, and to the Royal Northern College of Music with Mark and Clark, or two Marks if you include Mark Elder, and the Junior Fellowship. And I think, we can safely say that there is a commonality between what James DePriest was saying and what Mark Heron and Clark were saying. But how was it? Were there any things in there that suddenly turned a light bulb on or turned one off, maybe? I don't know.
Well, I always say that I learned how to rehearse in Manchester.
Yeah.
I came away from Juilliard having a technique that worked. I was able to get the results that I wanted to, and I came to Manchester to audition for the Junior Fellowship, and it's quite a lot of rounds. It's quite intense, and I remember Mark Elder just pushing me to listen. What do you hear? What do you hear? And how are you going to make it better?
Yeah.
It sounds so simple, doesn't it? So simple. And it is very simple, I suppose. But it had never really been put to me in that way before. And because of the nature of the Junior Fellowship, you're working in opera, you're working with wind bands, you're working with orchestra, you're working with singers, you're doing everything. And so it was just wonderful to spend time with Mark and Clark, to always be pushed to say, right, I've heard 5 things that you should pick up on after that first run through. What are they? Go. And you really do think on the fly. They talk about psychology. They talk about rehearsal technique. And of course, I can't rehearse the same way that Mark Elder rehearses, but I can use my ear, aspire to use my ear in the same way that Mark Elder does, and then try and make it better.
Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? I've said it to students in the past. Also, when I taught the violin, about listening harder to the sound that you're producing. You're not just listening to check that A, is it the right note, and B, is it in tune. It's to do with how the note connects at the beginning and the end to the previous and the following note. It's how that part is part of a phrase. It's, and the same applies when we're conducting. We can stand there and think, is this together? Are these the right notes? But that's not enough. No. You need to think about the balance, and that can be a very personal thing, balance. You need to think about the phrasing. And again, that's a very personal thing, but also with the psychology of somebody maybe playing a solo. It's a very, very, very important thing. And I think some conducting students, the penny never drops. And I think that's a shame. Same with
It never
instrumental
does. They
students.
just look very pretty.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, they look very good,
mm.
but there's nothing behind it.
Yeah, exactly true. Absolutely true. Yeah, it's very easy to stand in front of a very good orchestra where, at that stage of your life, the RNCM Symphony Orchestra, maybe even the Halle and the BBC Phil and people like that, and just stand there and go, this is great. I've got nothing to say. Well, they don't want that. They want you to say something, and they want to take it to a next level. There is no such thing as perfection. Take it to another place. Take it to make it yours or make it better. Yeah, very interesting. It sounds like that was the final bit of the jigsaw on top of years of people talking about technique and then different ways of rehearsing in different countries and all of that. It sounds like it was fascinating. On and out into the big wide world, the scary moments when we're no longer a student, Dame. We've all been there. And you have one assistant conductor of Orchestra Nationale de France with Kurt Masur, and an associate conductor of Opera Holland Park. Again, to me, that seems like the perfect sort of starting first rung on the ladder kind of thing. As an assistant to a great orchestra with an international great conductor, and then also an association with a group. How did you find those? Flitting between the two of those, or working as early steps? Were they the right things?
Yeah, I think they were wonderful things because you could work in different genres and with different groups of musicians. It was always so interesting to watch somebody of the stature of Kurt Masur work with the very great orchestras of the world, whether it was the Orchestra Nationale or the New York Philharmonic or the LPO. I mean, with these great conductors, you have to sort of try and distill what works, because again, like I was saying before, you can't rehearse an orchestra like Kurt Masur used to rehearse the LPO or the New York Philharmonic or whatever. And just Maestro Masur, his depth of connection to these really central European composers like Beethoven and Mendelssohn and Dvorak. I still have my scores littered with things that KM does this here, KM does that there. So it was just wonderful to really see what a top flight maestro did with top flight orchestras.
Yeah.
And then Holland Park was, I'd had some great experiences doing opera at the RNCM, but then going to do it in London at Holland Park, which became a real musical home, actually, after the initial associate conductor thing. It's a fantastic place to work. James Clutton still runs the place, and he manages to get really excellent singers who love working there because it's a great company to work for, to really put on opera at an excellent level, and to learn how to accompany, to learn lessons that I learned there. I find myself coming back to all the time. You have an ideal tempo in your head for a Rossini aria or a Rossini ensemble, really complex coloratura stuff. And you think, no, I want it fast. And the music stuff there, the repetiteurs, but one of them in particular would come and say, look, do you want it to be your tempo or do you want it to be right? It's a great lesson.
What a good line. I like that. That's wonderful. Can I linger on something you said earlier on about it's impossible to rehearse like Kurt Masur? And I want to make this clear to the non-playing, non-conducting listeners that I know I have. The reason being is that Kurt Masur rehearsed like he did because of years and years and years of experience of his life conducting great orchestras, but his own journey from wherever he started from until the end. If we started to copy people like that, it's insincere. It's not you. You're not rehearsing. You have to rehearse using your own experience. Your own experiences. And so yours have been watching Kurt Masur, but you could never rehearse like him because of that, because you haven't had his experiences. That's right, isn't it? That's basically what you're saying.
Exactly. And he was at the very end of his life when I met him. And so he was older than everybody in the room, more experienced, more famous than everybody in the room. So he could even treat the New York Philharmonic like children. And if imagine if I went in as a 20-something-year-old conductor and started treating orchestras like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not going to happen. Well, it could happen, but it would not be a very good career move. The first thing, which is basically yours, is 2014. You become principal conductor of the Xi'an Symphony Orchestra in China. How did that first come about? I mean, I know we all go and guest conduct all over the world and end up in some weird and wonderful places. But was that a sort of a love at first sight thing, or was it a long relationship that built to end up with you being the boss?
It was pretty much a love at first sight thing. It was out of the blue. I was contacted by a musician colleague with whom I'd worked in Manchester, actually, who's from Xi'an. And he said, oh, the Xi'an Symphony is looking for a principal conductor. Would you be interested? I said, yeah, okay, sure. I didn't expect I'd get a phone call or anything like that. And then I got an email saying, oh, would you like to come and conduct a concert with us? I said, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. I still didn't think it was going to happen.
Yeah.
And then they flew me out there. I conducted them, and then they offered me the job. And then it was the start of this wonderful relationship, because it was a very young orchestra. It'd only been around for not even 2 years when I took over. And it was mostly young players as well, almost all Chinese players. Probably about half of them were from Xi'an. And so everything we did was for the first time for the orchestra, first time for the city, which is one of the most ancient cities in China. It was the very first capital of China, actually.
Mm.
And so we did the city's first Beethoven cycle. We did the first Brahms cycle, Mahler symphonies, the first staged opera. And it was really a really fantastic opportunity because I didn't have the benefit of this that you get in established orchestras, this corporate experience of how to play Beethoven or how to play Brahms. And so I had to really work out in my head, okay, so what do I think makes Beethoven and what makes Brahms?
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating that an orchestra was so young in its life, that and as you said, that they had no corporate memory even of how to play some of the great composers. What sort of being such a young orchestra, what are they like what are they like? What were they like in rehearsal at that time? I mean, had things sort of transferred from the West, in inverted commas, about how to behave in rehearsals? What to expect from conductors, what not to expect. I mean, what was it like, just the orchestral discipline of the orchestra when you first started there?
Yeah, it's funny you asked that, Mike, because when I first arrived, there wasn't much orchestral discipline to speak of.
Yeah.
And so, the third viola player would say, sorry, I'm not going to be at rehearsal this afternoon. I've got to go and teach. And that was pretty common. People would rock up late. People would turn up not having a clue how to play their music. And so these really simple culture changes to the orchestra improved the playing immeasurably. This is before any rehearsing or anything like that, just changing the culture of professionalism in the orchestra changed the sound.
Yeah.
And these were very technically adept players. So there was a lot of possibility once we were all rowing in the same direction.
I mean, to some degree, this feels like almost the perfect gig, in the fact that you've got, a room full of talented musicians who've only been playing together for 2 years, and you can come in and you can make them to use a footballing analogy, you can make them play your formation, your tactics. You can press or not press. You can have, you can basically do exactly what you want. It's different from if you join an orchestra as a music director and they've been alive for 60, 100, 150 years because of the corporate way that an orchestra is. It will take longer for them to take on your formations, take on who's taking the free kicks, all of that sort of stuff. With an orchestra like this, it feels like it's almost the perfect gig, but you have to really work hard at getting that to happen, don't you?
You've got to work very, very hard, and because there's no sort of corporate sensibilities, you have to be very. You've got no checks and balances on your power as a conductor in a way, because when you conduct an established orchestra, if you do something dumb, normally they won't follow you.
Yes,
or they'll cover it up very graciously. But here, I used to record everything I did in Xi'an, really, just to listen back to make sure that I was that the sound and the intonation and the ensemble and the interpretations and the style, everything was good. But it was really great to be able to develop an understanding. And so after a few years, there wasn't that much talking required, actually. They really knew what was expected of them and how to make music together. And the greatest compliment was when we had visiting soloists, and we had some really great visiting soloists, because they would do the China tour, and they would always compliment the Xi'an Orchestra on how they listened. And I was very proud of that.
Well, that's great. It's interesting you're talking about, and again, something I hadn't really thought about, but it jogged my memory. Yesterday, I edited an episode for my Patreon page where Joshua Weilerstein and I chatted, and I asked him 10 new questions for Patreon. And we got talking about the differences between choral conducting and orchestral conducting. And he was saying that, a chorus seems to want to follow you much, much, much more trustingly than an orchestra was. And he actually said, and that's what reminded me of this, he said, if you screw up with a professional orchestra, they have the corporate ability to look at you and go, no, we're not doing that. We're not going over the cliff there because you screwed up. We're just going to carry on doing what we should be doing. Whereas a choir will go over the cliff with you if they're following you and you suddenly screw up. It sounds like you had the ability there to quite easily drive off the cliff if you screwed up, because they were going to follow your every move, which, you don't have if you conduct the Liverpool Phil or the LPO. Yeah. I mean, that puts pressure really on you, but it does mean that they probably will be great accompanists quite quickly, because they're willing to follow you.
They really do follow, and they really do listen. And it was scary, especially at the beginning, to think, well, they really are dependent on everything that I do. But it was a great place to really get deep into all this repertoire in somewhere totally out of the way. I mean, people talk about these superstar Wunderkind conductors now not being able to develop in obscurity in some C-grade German opera house. But I tell you what, if you go to China, you have a great chance to just develop under the radar, trial this repertoire, and see where it takes you.
Yeah. It seems almost inevitable, because of where you currently are and where you were born, that the subject of travel is going to come up. And looking ahead, I mean, you must have been there already, but looking ahead, your life is going to be Xi'an in China, Opera Queensland, where you're associate music director and resident conductor, and also have a position back at the university. And then in later this year, you start as the boss in Hawaii. Now, let's pick 3 random places on the planet and see if we can become a commuter between 3 of the most vastly far away places. You must have some coping strategies, Dane, to do with time differences, to do with jet lag. Do you and your manager build in as much time as possible when you get there, or do you just have to cope with it? Within 24 hours, you are conducting the first rehearsal. How do you manage?
if it's possible, I will always try and arrive a couple of days at least early. There's nothing worse than getting in at 10 o'clock at night and then having to be at rehearsal at 9:30 or 10 o'clock the next morning. It's horrible, and it's not fair on anybody, really.
Mm.
So if there's time, then I'll make it work. I've become I've become quite adept at hacking frequent flyer programs. So I've got all kinds of spreadsheets of the best ways to accumulate points and the best credit cards to have to accumulate status with various airlines. So you've got a better chance of getting upgraded, or you don't have to arrive at the airport as early, or if something goes pear-shaped in your travels, then you're looked after a bit better.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to say, it's getting harder the older I get. There was a time when it was actually before the pandemic, when I was living in London and dividing my time between London, Xi'an, and Australia. I mean, they did some absolutely crazy things, like fly from London to Australia to do 3 days of rehearsals and a concert, then fly back to London to do a rehearsal, and then go to Xi'an and do a week of concerts or whatever. It was crazy, and so I'm trying to temper all that now, really. But somebody once told me that if you put your feet in the soil when you get somewhere, it helps you to adjust. And it is maybe it is mumbo jumbo, but I always try and go barefoot somewhere on the beach in Hawaii, or through the bush in Australia when I get somewhere, just to sort of feel connected to the place.
I think that the metaphor I would use of similar thing is, I've never really struggled with jet lag and things like that. And I wonder whether this is the reason why. The minute I sit on the plane, I change my watch and to the place where I'm going to, and always try and imagine that that's what the time is. Because the great thing about planes is that once the blinds are down, you have no idea what the time actually is, whether it's day outside or not. And that's always been my coping strategy, similar to walking barefoot on the ground, is I make sure that I mentally have walked barefoot. I am now in the place I'm flying to. And I mean, it works for me. Whether it'll carry on working the older I get, I don't know. But it's such an important point that you make. Not to get there. I've had a few, like we all have. Travels have been delayed. I've got there at 1 a.m. and I'm on at 9:30. The same morning. It's just horrendous. And I had that once. I was bumped off a flight. And going back to your frequent flyer thing, these are first world problems, but it does help if you've got frequent flyer miles. You can at least check in business rather than even if you're not flying in it, and that and then you get looked after a bit. But I was bumped off a flight to Buenos Aires and ended up going 24 hours later, which meant that I arrived. Oh, no. I arrived the same morning that I was due to rehearse, and that first rehearsal, it just felt horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And you think, this is not fair on anybody.
No, it's not fair. And you hope people are sort of sympathetic, but I don't know that orchestras are sympathetic, or that they even have to be, really, because conductors are so jet-setting these days that it's sort of par for the course that people just fly in. I mean, it's not quite like Gergiev, but still.
No, exactly. Yeah. Well, it might be worth pointing out that at the moment he's probably not getting quite as many frequent flyer miles as he used to. No. But anyway, let's not linger on that. I mentioned it just now that
you get frequent flyer miles in a private jet.
Well, exactly. Very good point. Well, I suppose I don't know. Maybe Putin's got his own loyalty program. Discuss anyway. I just mentioned the fact that you got this position back at the University of Queensland, and I read somewhere in one of your bios, either in your agent or on your own website, that will involve teaching. Now, we've mentioned so many names, and you've had such a lot of experience of being taught or mentored by some great names and some lesser-known people, but they've still very much impacted on your life. When you teach, do you have a sort of style or ethos? Do you always think, about the James DePriest way of, you be you and I'll sort of mold you and shape you? And do you have any fundamentals that you insist on?
I think knowledge of the score is really important. It's I was really surprised when I started teaching that I would say in general, maybe it's just the students I had, but I think it's pretty common that they didn't know the scores well enough. Yeah, they could sort of hum along to a recording or something, but and they probably practice to recordings. And recordings are great and they really inform what we do. But if you can't conjure up the sonic picture in your mind, then how on earth are you ever going to put it into your hands?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's a big thing that I suppose that is a universal thing that I do insist on, and is knowing the score. And so I sort of help them analyze and prepare a score in the way that works for me, just because I remember when I was coming through, especially going to Siena with Gelmanti, and there were something like 40 pieces, including big full-length symphonies. It's the first time I did, Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun or the Beethoven symphonies or the Tchaikovsky symphonies. I had no idea how, as an 18-year-old going to Siena for the first time, and you look at L'Après-Midi, how the hell do you conduct it? I had no idea. No idea at all. And so I do help them prepare scores. I just show them how I do it, and they can do it. They can continue using my method or not. And then when it comes to the hands, as long as it's clear, as long as it says something and conveys what they want to convey, that's all I care about, really.
Yeah. Well, you've just dipped your toe into the 11th question, which is coming anyway, about score study. So are you somebody who uses any piano skills, or are you an inner ear person? And as you well know, I'm interested in whether you are a scribbler or a non-scribbler. Are you a red, blue, and black? And what's interesting about that is you just mentioned it yourself. I do the same. I offer them this is my system. This is why I do it. This is how I do it. But please don't. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. As long as you've learnt the score, it doesn't matter whether your score's plastered with stuff or not, or it's completely blank. You've got to learn the score. But how do you do it?
Well, I generally don't use a piano, although if I have one handy, I will pull it out and play very badly through a vocal score of an opera, or if it's particularly crunchy harmonically, I will just sort of play it at the piano. But as well as I do, half the time on the road, you've got no access to a piano anyway.
No.
So it's a good way to work on those muscles in your inner ear. So I do write on my scores, probably less so than I used to. And for many, many, many years now, it's always been a 2B pencil. That's it. No color, just a 2B pencil. And for me, most of the time, it depends on how the piece sort of ticks of its own accord. But for most pieces, I work out the phrases. It just, and I rule a big line. I don't even rule. I just freehand, just scribble a line. It's much quicker.
Yeah. Down
the whole score. And it's for some reason, it just helps me organize in my own head this, the micro and the macro architecture of the piece. So, and then I'll write in salient details, some important instruments or dynamics or tempo markings or beat patterns if it's very complex. But that 2B pencil is not as dark as a 4B, and it's not like I can easily refer to them when I'm actually in rehearsal. So it's more of just making conscious of what I'm discovering about a score.
It's funny, I was doing exactly the same. I do use a ruler, but in the half an hour before we met this morning, or this evening for you, I was doing exactly the same. I was drawing in some, every 4 bars, and then there was a 3-bar phrase, and then there was, and I don't do it in every score because, some scores are always 4 bars long, but sometimes you just need that grid reference and it helps you. And I've often said it, I don't think my missus ever really understood how much time I would be spending in here learning this stuff. Because before, I started conducting, I was a violinist who used to play for 5 or 6 hours a day, and I never practiced at home because I never needed to. But you do have to spend your hours in your study with your scores, don't you? It's simple as that. Whether it's drawing red horizontal lines across breaking up the systems as I do, or the 4-bar, phrasings, or whatever it is, it takes time.
Yeah, I mean, do you enjoy it? I know some people say they love spending time with scores, but that's not my favorite part of the job. My favorite part is actually being with people. But I know we have to study the scores. I don't know.
It
Do you
depends.
like it?
Well, it depends. I mean, I did a concert very recently with the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, which was 21 small items from the James Bond film franchise. That's 21 small scores. And, most of them are quite easy to conduct. They're all arrangements, but they still needed markings in. And that felt like a chore because I just wanted to get out there and conduct the 2 soloists and my favorite orchestra and conduct the concert. However, there are pieces that are sitting on the shelves behind me that I've yet to conduct that I absolutely adore. And the scores are completely clean because I've yet to conduct them and I've yet to be asked to conduct them. But when I do, I will love poring over those scores and finding out and doing some historical research and working out the phrasings. And so, yes, there are times I could get lost in a score for hours in this room because it's a score that I deeply adore and I've been asked to conduct for the first time. I've got a couple next to me. I've never conducted the 4 last songs. I'm doing that quite soon. And, I will just get lost in that. Yeah, exactly. And I remember the first time I was asked to conduct Mahler 5, which is in the same concert as the 4 last songs. And that score is, I spent hours. I just, look up and think, oh my God, it's 5 o'clock. I've been in here since 10. What happened to lunch? That's what it's like with a score that you love. Whereas there are others you just think, well, I've just got to get this done because actually the most exciting thing to come is to just get there and conduct them, and that concert was extremely exciting. I couldn't wait to get there and do the rehearsal and do the concert. But yeah, that was more of a chore because you've got 21 little things. You've still got to write in the tempo marking, all of that sort of stuff. And the older you get, I need to see things in red and blue because my eyesight is not what it was. So it's just something popping off the page helps me out. So I do have to do it. I have to spend the time. But yeah, it's a very valid question. Very valid. Are you a young conductor, thirsty for knowledge and wanting to discover more about the world of conducting? Then my Patreon page is there for you. I'm constantly posting new content there based on my experiences as a conductor and an ex-orchestral player. And I offer you the chance to ask me any question any time of the day. For instance, you might like to ask me how to mark up a score, as we've just been discussing. When you subscribe, you will gain access to interviews, video posts, tour diaries, articles, and much more. If you pay for the whole year, then you'll gain a 10% discount, and if you're a student, contact me directly and there will be a further discount. All of this can be found at patreon.com/a mic on the podium, and from just £5 a month, you gain access to this ever-growing resource on conductors and conducting. That's patreon.com. Details and links to the page are in the show notes attached to this episode. Now, the all-important 10 questions with my guest, Dane Lam. Dane, as somebody who's listened to many, and again, I thank you for doing so, of my episodes, you know what's coming now. It's unavoidable.
I do indeed.
Yeah, which is good. But still, the important thing for us to traverse. And it's the 10 questions. And as you know, I always start with what sound or noise do you love and what sound or noise do you hate?
Well, I do love being in nature and I love the sound of the ocean, but I also love scuba diving. And I still will never forget the first time that I went under the ocean. And it is so noisy. It really is like a metropolis. Fish swimming everywhere, chomping coral, having little fights, the sound of whales sometimes. So I would say the sound I love is the underwater sound of the ocean. And the sound that I really hate, and it's become worse with the advent of mobile phones, is people listening to music or videos obnoxiously loud or even audible, if I'm honest, without headphones on the subway or on the tube or in public parks or on beaches. hate it.
Oh my God. To pacify a child on a flight, give them a tablet and they
Oh,
play. Oh, yeah, I've come so close to saying you can't afford headphones, or and I'm so glad you said scuba diver, because I've been waiting for somebody to who's a scuba diver for hundreds of episodes. The nearest I got was Otto Tausk recently, who's a massive swimmer, and I said to him, "Have you ever done?" And he said, "No, he's never done it, and he's thinking about it." But I agree with you. My wife and I went to the Maldives on holiday, and I'd never even snorkeled, and we snorkeled a lot on that holiday. And you're right, it's really noisy under there, isn't it? I'd never realized it, but
yeah.
what a fascinating answer. Brilliant answer. You're the first in 100 and whatever episodes, so thank you. That's brilliant.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, that's good. I've been waiting for a scuba diver. That's wonderful.
So I can't believe there's no other. I mean, it's quite a nice thing to do when you're guest conducting, depending on where you're guest conducting.
Well, yeah.
I mean, Hawaii is a great place for it. But actually, when I was in Orkney once, I decided to learn how to dive with a dry suit. So you can really scuba dive anywhere.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, yeah, it helps if you're going to be the music director of the Hawaii Symphony Orchestra. That really does help. Well, let's see if you would spend your 24 hours free underwater. But how would you like to spend your 24 hours free?
Well, it does. It does involve the ocean. It definitely would involve the beach. There's an island off the coast of Brisbane, my hometown. It's called Stradbroke Island, and it is the second largest sand island in the world, and it's not connected by a bridge or anything. You got to take a boat or a vehicle ferry over there, and it's gorgeous. It's got the most untouched beaches, wonderful fresh seafood. So I'd start the day with a bushwalk around the point, and you can walk through the gorge and look down. You can see manta rays and dolphins, and if it's in season, there are whales. Then I would have a lovely breakfast with a nice coconut flat white from this little coffee van down at the beach. And then I would probably cook a nice long lunch to be enjoyed with family and friends on a veranda of a beach house overlooking the ocean. Fall asleep gazing up at the stars, because you can see lots of stars out there.
Yeah. Well, that sounds amazing. And I think what's wonderful about the people who do listen to this podcast, I then interview, is that you've probably been thinking about that answer for quite a long time. And it's a wonderful answer.
It's nice. You give us advance notice of these questions.
I do. That is very true. Which means that you've probably been thinking quite a lot about question 4. 5, of course, that is one that's a contentious one. But question 4 is, can you name your favourite conductors of yesteryear?
Well, actually, I found question 4 harder than question 5 in a way, because there are so many conductors I admire in this plethora of repertoire, really.
Yeah.
So, of course, my teachers, Gelmati and James de Priest and Mazur, they all influenced me in various ways. But when I was a young conductor and having to absorb a lot of music very quickly at Juilliard and in Siena especially, I always went to the recordings of Claudio Abbado, because I always found that they would be invariably tasteful, well thought out, have some element of historical informedness, if that's a word.
Yeah.
To them. And actually, when I got into Juilliard, I booked tickets to Carnegie Hall. He was opening the season of Carnegie Hall with the Lucerne Festival Orchestra, doing Mahler 3. And so that's the first thing I did when Juilliard offered me the place. And then he cancelled, and then he died a couple of years after that. So I never saw Abbado live.
Shame. I never did either. And yeah, he's sort of in a list of people I wished I'd played for. I started playing in 1991 when he was very much still alive. Him, Haitink, and Kleiber, I would love to have played for.
Oh yeah.
And you're right about his recordings. Often I feel that it's not. You're not going to be suddenly shocked by thinking, well, what on earth have you done that for? It feels informed his interpretive moments feel natural, but there is always a sort of faithfulness, another word that probably doesn't exist, to the score, which again, if you're learning a score for the first time, you want somebody who's going to be fairly faithful to it and not just ride roughshod over the stuff that was written all these years ago.
There was sort of an easy lyricism, an easy flow to them. So many of us as young conductors really, really revere Bernstein, but almost always, especially his later recordings, I just find them very, very slow.
Yeah. His recording, which seems to be lauded, of the Leningrad Symphony, I cannot abide, because the march, the central march of the first movement of Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony is so slow. Oh, yes. God. Yeah.
He could get away with it, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, exactly. But you're right, absolutely right. We all listen to a lot of recordings. I'm sure we all do. And as many people have said in the past on the podcast, if you don't listen to recordings, you're a liar. I agree with that. All of us do, because we want to know what other people are doing. And also we want to look back on what the greats of the past did. We would be stupid not to listen to a Bruno Walter recording of a Mahler symphony if he made one, because he knew Mahler.
Yes, exactly.
So we all go back and listen. And if you find somebody like Abbado who more often than not ticks the boxes for you, brilliant. That makes perfect sense. Now, you just said you found Question 5 easier. And so who would be your favourite current conductor or conductors?
Yeah, well, I'm not really afraid of offending people, because there's a lot of people I admire. Of course, I admire Mark Elder, who really taught me to open my ears.
Yeah.
And of people that I haven't really had a close association with. One of them would be Ivan Fischer, who I saw in concert quite a few times. And then he actually came to Xi'an with the Budapest Festival Orchestra, because we have an amazing concert hall in Xi'an, just a great acoustic. And so I was able to sit in on his rehearsal there as well, and go and just say hello after the concert. And just his way of working with the orchestra and building this orchestra that obviously loves working together and loves the music and loves him. He would have the courage to try different orchestral formations, for example, like having the bassoon sit right up the front of the stage next to him in Dvorak's symphony, in fact. I mean, it's a bit mad, really, but it worked. And then he would have the string players play an encore and the rest of the orchestra sing it. It was really inspiring to see how he approaches music, but also his recordings and his performances live that I've seen of things like the Mahler symphonies, the Brahms symphonies, or the Brahms Hungarian dances. They're so idiosyncratic in the very best way. I don't think he's trying to be different, but by the same token, he's not trying to regurgitate anything. And the other conductor who I admire is Gianandrea Noseda, who was at the BBC Philharmonic when I was at the RNCM, and he's turned up in various places of the world I've been, and I just love his animal energy. It's just electric. It's really electric, and when it works, it really galvanizes an orchestra.
I played for him on a couple of occasions. One in particular I remember because I was on trial for the principal's second violin job, so I was leading the section, and we were playing part of the program was Dvorak's Water Goblin. To be that close to him, you could feel the energy. I mean, you could feel the sweat actually bounce off him onto you.
I was going to say
but you could feel the energy. Absolutely, I loved playing for him. I thought he really made me want to play for him. And Fischer, you're right. The idiosyncrasy of his recordings, of his performances. I was fascinated when he took on the Concertgebouw conducting masterclasses that you can watch online to see how he thought about conducting. And actually, he thinks about it quite deeply. There were quite a few things on there which he said, and I thought, I agree with that. Absolutely, wholeheartedly. It was a fascinating insight into how the man thinks. And as you said, I don't think any of it is idiosyncratic on purpose. I think it's just him being naturally him, and that's how it comes out.
Yeah, I think so. And actually, I just thought of someone else, if you'll permit me one more.
Please.
Uh, um, so the other conductor I would add to that list is Rene Jacobs.
Ah,
Uh, I have done and continue to do a lot of Mozart operas, and they're very dear to me. And I think the way that Rene Jacobs approaches the Mozart operas and approaches the shaping of recitatives and arias and ensembles, they are idiosyncratic, and you can't copy what Rene Jacobs does.
yeah.
But they are very personal, and I think that's great for us to be challenged sometimes into these works that have been performed so many times. And if I'm want to listen to a Mozart opera, I'll often go to Jacob's recording, and I just find them so refreshing. I don't want to be uncollegial, but he's dead. So Carl Böhm, I can't sit through his Mozart. It's leaden and humorless.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the point about listening to somebody's really personal views on things is that it makes you then sit and look at your score if you're listening to a Mozart opera, or I did it with Roger Norrington's Beethoven symphonies. I'd sit there and think, look, I understand why you're doing that. I understand that's your personal point of view. I totally disagree with it. The next sentence you have to then say as a conductor is, but what do you think about it, Mike? Or Dane? Therefore, I have to form an opinion myself. I cannot just sit there and let it be a bland, as you said, humorless Mozart or whatever. I think what they do is they challenge us to think, whether we agree with their personal views or not. Yeah.
And you put yourself on the line if you do something a little different. I know that orchestras want a vision, but sometimes if you go too far outside the boundaries of what is in good taste, people look at you very strangely sometimes, unless you've won their trust.
Yeah.
But it's nice to, I think people like Rene Jacobs or even Ivan Fischer give me courage.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I like that. Number 6, what is the hardest work you've ever conducted? Or works? I've often had more than one.
Well, the hardest performance I've ever had to do was quite a few years ago in Xi'an, and we were performing Mahler 4. It was the first Mahler symphony we'd ever performed together. And at that same time, my grandma, with whom I was very close growing up, died back in Australia. But in Xi'an, it's hard to get somebody to come and conduct Mahler 4 with a couple of days' notice.
Yeah.
And I knew that my grandma wouldn't want me to come back for her funeral and leave these wonderful musicians in the lurch in Xi'an. And so when it came to our performance, I gave a speech and I dedicated it to my grandma. And boy, did those players, they really, really played, especially the slow movement. I mean, It was just, it was something very, very special. But it was really difficult to do at the time.
I bet it was. I think you and I have a similar view. I think, you did what she would have wanted you to have done. By leaving your orchestra in the lurch and going back, you were only pleasing the people who are still here alive, social convention and that sort of thing. However tough it must have been at the time. But yeah, it must be very, very, very difficult. I personally think you did the right thing, but I'm sure there are other listeners who probably thought, "What?" But no, I that must have been really tough. And especially that slow movement. It's so beautiful and so sort of timeless and floating and ethereal, and that's tough. And good on your orchestra for it's difficult when emotion gets involved with music making, that sometimes it can actually go quite badly wrong in the other direction, can't it?
That's right. Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
that's a concert you're never going to forget, and no wonder you chose that as your answer. Absolutely. Number seven, and let's face it, you do some traveling, Dane. When you travel abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
I take a very special, well, not that special. It's, I bought it off the internet, but it's a pillow that it just suits the way I sleep. It has two ways. If you're sleeping on your back, you have it one way. If you're sleeping on your side, you have it another way. And it's quite bulky, but it comes with a little vacuum bag. So you can get it down quite small. It's amazing
Mm.
how small it goes. And so it's so hard going to some of these hotels, particularly in Europe, actually, with the softest, most flimsy, thinnest pillows you've ever had. And it's so important the way you sleep.
Mm.
So that's one little travel hack I've picked up. I always take a pillow with me.
I'd quite like you to send me the link for that pillow, please. I've not long, a few weeks ago, I spent 2 weeks in Cologne in Germany working with an orchestra I absolutely love. But German pillows, they just seem to be a sort of cloth bag full of air. There's
Yes.
nothing inside them at all. I ended up with sort of three pillows that basically enveloped my head because they wasn't giving me any support at all. So yes, after this, I would like the link to buy one of those. If I can vacuum pack it back into my suitcase, that would be
Yeah, I'll
brilliant.
happily send it.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Number eight, as you know, this can be real or fantasy. What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
Um, I think is the one thing I would change would be this historical hangover of these tyrants on the podium that have set musicians and conductors apart. I think it's always hard that in general the relationship starts from a point of maybe not antagonism but being in different courts,
Them and us.
and
Yeah.
you have to, you hope you unite these two different worlds, and so they see you as one of them, or at least somebody that they can trust. um Even socially, I mean, it's great guest conducting, in fact, because there's a little more latitude in terms of being able to chat to the players and maybe have a beer or whatever. But there's still this distance, and I think we're all working towards the same goal. And if we recognize that, well, things are changing, I suppose. Orchestras and conductors, there's less of the us and them than there used to be, but still, when you walk into a new orchestra for the first time, it's something you have to surmount.
Here. I agree with you completely. I think it is getting better. I think more musicians realize that actually the guy or the girl on the box is not there just to rake in a huge fee, be a dictator, and make your life a misery. That most of them are coming at it from the I want to make music with you and let's do this the best way possible, please angle. I think more musicians are realizing that. I think that there will always be, I make a debut next week. On Monday morning, I stand in front of the Lahti Symphony Orchestra for the first time in Finland. There will always be a moment of, 70 or 80 people looking at you going, thinking, right, what are you going to be like and how are you going to affect the next 4 days of my life? And I think there will always be that. Whether they want to be collegial with you or whether they expect you to be more dictatorial. But I think more musicians these days are wanting to, not embrace, but at least not push away the person who stood on the podium, and I think that's a good thing. But I
That's
completely
right.
agree with you.
It's scary, isn't it? That
Yeah,
first day of rehearsal is always the moment of truth.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm lucky. Next week I go with a program of music that I devised and I've conducted before elsewhere. So it's stuff
Oh,
that I
that's
know.
great.
Yeah, stuff I can immediately get right into, get my hands dirty, take my jumper off, get my hands wringing wet, and get in there and get working, But yeah, it is always scary. I just think it's got slightly less scary than it used to be. But there are still
Yes.
people there who want to fight you. I've had that as well, just before
Yep.
the
It
pandemic.
happens.
Yeah,
It's better than more musicians who try to learn to conduct, and then they realize that it's not so easy.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I think it should be compulsory that everybody in a professional orchestra should spend 15 minutes conducting them. Then you'd realize
Yeah.
quite how difficult it is, and what it's like to look out at a sea of angry faces. Going back on the point that I made about meeting somebody who wanted to fight just before the pandemic. Have spent a lot of time, as we all did during lockdown, thinking about it, because it was one of the last gigs I did before the pandemic hit. I've now realised that if that ever happened to me again, I would quite happily turn around to the orchestra and say, I'm sorry, I'm not here for this. I don't care how big the fee is. I'm not willing to put up with this. And I would just walk out and walk away and go home. I'm not willing to
Good
put
on
up
you.
with somebody who wants to fight with me because they don't like me and who I've never met. I would literally just walk out and go home. My life is too short for me to want to win over insert expletive here person. So there we go. Question number 9. I've had every single possible answer. The most popular being airline pilot. I wonder whether, having sat on one, you wish to be a pilot quite so often. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Well, I really enjoy cooking, particularly Chinese food, because it's my heritage. But I don't think that the hours of traveling as a conductor and performing on the weekends are sort of antisocial, but the hours of a chef are even more antisocial.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think I would quite like to have a little Airbnb somewhere beautiful. Well, not an Airbnb because I don't like that company. Just a regular old B&B, and just cook for interesting people who came through. Not have to do it to order, but have a couple of rooms and just live in a beautiful place. Cook for people, have some nice wine with people. And then the other thing I would quite like to attempt, this is a bit naughty actually, but I wouldn't mind trying to be a director, because the number of times I've sat through opera productions where the director is not getting any of his or her information from the score and from the music, it just drives me to distraction. So it'd be interesting to try that profession.
Well, that director thing has come up in the past. I remember Roy Goodman talking about it, in some of the Handel operas he's done. He did, where he mentioned the fact that none of the directions seem to have anything to do with the score whatsoever. The director had just grabbed the story and gone off in a completely different direction with it. I like the B&B answer. I suspect your B&B would be pretty near the coast, so that
I think so. Yeah.
yeah, on your downtime you can get out there and swim or scuba dive. And I agree with you about Airbnb. I've done it once. Normally, of course, conductors are put up in hotels. It depends on how the orchestra does it. Some of them give you a budget and you sort out your own accommodation. Others will put you up in a hotel that they have a deal with, and that's where you always stay. I did it once. I hated it. Living in somebody else's flat with their shoes in the corner and their cornflakes in the cupboard, and I'm never doing it again. So yeah, but yeah, I think cooking for people who appreciate it rather than, as you said, brutal the hours that chefs. And it's also very similar to the job we do. You're in charge of a team of chefs underneath you, and no, very good answer. And seeing as we're talking about food and cooking, we come to the final question, and my favourite of the lot. If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Well, I would start off with some cocktails. I really enjoy a Negroni and a wet martini with a twist, in fact. So with a bit more vermouth than is usual.
Yeah.
And then it had to be fresh seafood, Queensland prawns, Tasmanian oysters, with some really good vintage champagne. And then it'd be onto the Chinese food. So it would be my secret, my dad's recipe, this family recipe of soy sauce chicken. There'd be roast duck. There would be these thick hand-pulled noodles that are common in Xi'an, and I've never had such chewy, delicious, nutty noodles with wonderful sauces as I have had in Xi'an. And a range of vegetable dishes, Chinese mushrooms and omelets and lobster. I mean, I just think the Chinese cuisine has the greatest range of food you could ever want to eat. There's something for everybody. And then I think I'd finish with a pavlova with tropical fruit and some more of that vintage champagne.
Wonderful. I was nodding away through the Chinese section of your menu because I am a huge fan of Chinese cooking. I've never conducted in China. I do hope to one day. Well, no, it's a lie. I did once conduct a Royal Philharmonic Concert Orchestra in Beijing. We went there. I was there for 2 days, and we had a wonderful meal after the concert. But I've never gone and conducted the Chinese orchestra, and I would love to, purely because I could spend my off time going to local restaurants and trying out food. And yeah, brilliant choice. My mouth was salivating. It's only 10 to 12. And I'm not going to eat until later on. But yeah, I was salivating. I always know it's a good answer when I start salivating. So brilliant. And brilliant it's been, Dane. Really enjoyed chatting to you. And I hope very soon, maybe not the vintage champagne, maybe between us we can't afford it, but we can sit down over a beer and a Chinese somewhere in the world and carry on chatting. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Next time I'm in the UK, we can sit down for that Chinese and maybe we can just get some non-vintage champagne.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat with a Finnish conductor who has held multiple title positions in his home country, as well as being a very successful composer. He's also known as being a highly regarded conducting teacher and has been teaching at the Sibelius Academy in Helsinki since 1991. But until then, bye-bye.